Hello there. This is a presentation about the sound architecture of my upcoming game, Acid Web. I thought I'd do this presentation because it might be of some technical interest, so it's not really about the game so much as an implementation detail of it. When I decided what my sound architecture would be, I thought about old arcade games. That's pretty much what my game looks like, so it ought to work well for my game, visually and gameplay wise. So old arcade games typically used, going far back, they typically used Yamaha YM chips. These are, some of the later ones are FM chips. And FM is a kind of synthesis method whereby you modulate one oscillator, the frequency of that oscillator, or in practice the phase with another to generate upper harmonics from very basic waveforms, sine waves. And that sort of carried on into home computers, personal computers, video game systems. So Sega Mega Drive is a good example of a video game system using an FM chip for most of its sounds. The PC had the AdLib and Sound Blaster sound cards, which utilized an FM chip in the Sound Blaster with the addition of a PCM chip, I guess. I'm not sure how that works, but it has an OPL2 chip, I believe. It has a very characteristic sound. So I'll start by just demonstrating the sounds. And if you've seen some videos on this channel before, you've probably already heard it. So these are some examples of sound effects from my game. I can't say distinct because there's such a history of sounds like this. Let's say short demonstration of the sounds. So that works by synthesizing the sounds in real time. So whenever I queue up a sound, it just sends it to a voice, which then plays it back based on patch data. So it's basically a synthesizer. And I'll show you how the voice architecture looks. And if you're interested in synthesis but not so technically inclined, maybe you'll recognize this as a synthesizer. Like these are the parameters. And the carrier and the modulator are, I wouldn't say self-explanatory, but the carrier is the sound you hear, sort of. If I turn down the level of the modulator, it's a very simple sound. But when I turn up the modulator, this is the oscillator that affects the frequency of the carrier. You get more harmonics. And quite unconventionally for an FM synth, I have two feedback loops, which means that then an oscillator can modulate itself via unit delay. I'll turn down the modulator again and I'll pull up the feedback on the carrier. So this is just the carrier modulating itself. So this basically changes the shape of the waveform into something with more harmonics. Sounds like kind of like a sawtooth waveform. And then at some point there's I'm not sure why this happens, but there's it's quite typical of FM synthesizers for that modulation to turn into, well, basically white noise with a slight tone to it. But what you can do then with the modulator, if you turn that up, if you put the feedback loop in the modulator, you have a little bit more control over the sound. And I can change the pitch. And because the sounds are synthesized in real time, I can add variations in real time as well. So this is a very static sound. But if I add some pitch variation, well, you get some variation, basically. I can add some level variations, so this pretty much varies this level amount. And also I have an envelope, or 2 envelopes for the sound. So these control the amplitude. The envelopes go up to the maximum level and then go down back down to 0. I can combine that with a pitch envelope. So if I pull up the pitch modulation, well, this is not a pleasant sound. This is more like it. Well, you get some quite interesting sounds. So I can step through some of the sounds here just to demonstrate the flexibility, which isn't much, but it's enough for me. The menu sounds are nice. And one interesting aspect of this way of doing things, which I'll explain later with the voice prioritization, is that if I retrigger a sound, it just sort of blends into itself. The envelope doesn't normally reset. You can actually make it reset by setting this to true. But normally it doesn't. So if you trigger many sound effects in succession, they just sort of blend into each other. So the minigun sound, this is like a continuous machine gun kind of weapon. If I trigger it repeatedly, you get this sort of vacuum cleanery sound. Whereas if I were to reset it, which is basically what I'd have to contend with if I had sampled sounds. Well, not necessarily, but in the most naive sense. I wouldn't get that blending. I would just get a repeated attack, which is for this sound is quite long, so you don't hear it. So that's probably the most generally interesting thing about the sound architecture. And this gets into more deeper into implementation details. So I'll show you here the sound scheduling and communication. And I'll start by a voice command. Well, in practice, there are 2 threads running, one audio thread and one game thread. And they have to communicate. And you want to avoid synchronization as much as possible because the audio is quite sensitive to delays. If I want the sound to come out promptly, I don't want to lock something to trigger a sound. So I created a command structure which has it has a set of parameters: the patch number, the panning, and the amplitude of the sound. And that's all I need for now anyway. This can be converted into an integer. When you issue a sound, you write that integer atomically. And that's something a modern CPU can do. And you tell it to be atomic just so the compiler doesn't reorder stuff, I guess. Then you send that off to a voice. And the voice will read that command and convert it back to a structure and then schedule it. And that runs once on every buffer. So every time I process a buffer, I check if there are queued commands and process them. This means that sounds only really occur at the start of buffers. And this is, well, in reality it causes some jitter, but I feel that it's fine not to have more precision timing-wise. Well, that's that. And the last part of this presentation is about the channel prioritization. Initially, I had a few channels, and I dedicated channels to specific purposes. I had like a menu channel, and then I had an enemy channel, or like enemy sound effect channel, one weapon channel, and so on and so forth. And this isn't very efficient when you have a bunch of different sound effects and many situations that could cause sound effects, but won't necessarily cause sound effects at all time. So maybe it's only a small portion of those types of sound effects that happen at once. For example, in the menu, it's only menu sound, so who cares about the other channels? So I came up with a voice router. This is basically a queue with a slight twist on it. So I add all the voices to the queue initially. And then when I play a sound, it picks the voice that's first in the queue and issues the command to that voice. And then it moves that queue entry to the back of the queue. That voice won't be used until all other voices have been used. So this sort of, it doesn't guarantee, but it sort of removes the problem of voice stealing. So you won't hear one voice suddenly being used for another sound, interrupting the first sound. But there's a twist on this, and this is find by patch. So the first thing the queue does, or when you try to play a sound, it looks through the whole queue of voices, a total of 12, I think. If the patch in the command I'm issuing is the same as the one last played on that voice, it'll reuse that voice. So that's why the minigun sound effect, for example, blended into itself. It reused the same voice. But if it can't find that patch in the voice queue, it'll just pick the last one. So this means that there will be sound interruptions, but normally only by the same sound effect, which is a nice property. First, because it saves channels, like I don't need as many channels to avoid voice stealing. And second, because of this blending effect, I can actually use that blending to my advantage when designing sounds. Well, that's that. Well, I'll say something about the convenience of editing sounds within the game. Like now I can play the game, and at any point I can pause the game. Here, for example, there's the pencil sound effect for the intro. I can edit this in place now. And you know, hear the result immediately. And I think this way of organizing sounds and creating sounds is quite nice. I prefer it over having recorded sounds because it's easier, and it's also a kind of guarantee that I stick to the style of old arcade games. I hope you enjoyed it. There are other videos on my channel about the game if you want to see more of the game. There's a Steam page for it now, and hopefully there will be a demo soon. So even if you don't want to buy it, you can play some of it to get an idea of what it is. Yeah, cool. See you later.